The air tasted like a penny held too long on the tongue. Dry heat and metal, the kind of recycled warmth that never reached your bones. The electrical hum in Frostline never stopped, not even when the lights dipped. I knew that by then. I knew the static in the walls could raise the hair on my wrist before a door unlocked or an intercom cracked awake. I knew enough to keep my head down. What I didn't know, standing in the north corridor with my badge in my hand, was whether the thing changing on it had started that night or long before I ever got there. The plastic was cold. My thumb kept sliding over the laminated edge. My name was printed under the photo, black letters on white. Then the letters moved. Not like ink running, not like heat warping the surface. The badge didn't bend, the plastic didn't soften, and it just stayed rigid while the name beneath the clear layer rearranged itself one letter at a time, calmly, like a clerk correcting a typo. I watched my own last name lose a letter, gain another, then become a name I hadn't spoken out loud in almost 2 years. Behind me, the intercom clicked. The low hum in the ceiling sharpened, rose, and a flat voice said, "Correction in progress." I looked down again. The face on the badge wasn't mine anymore. It wasn't blurred, it wasn't blank. It was a man's face I knew in the deepest part of myself from sodium lights and diesel fumes and a night I had spent every waking hour trying not to remember. His eyes looked past me, his mouth was half open as if he was about to say my name. Then the intercom clicked a second time and said, "Please confirm identity." I still don't know which part of me answered first, the man holding the badge or the one already inside it. If the badge knew who I was before I did, then who had been walking Frostline in my place? It started 5 nights earlier, with a flight north and a signature I had no business making. By the time I got to Frostline's psychiatric containment site, I was the kind of man remote jobs were built for. I traveled light. I didn't ask for much. I liked places where the roads ended early, where the weather did half the keeping out for you, and where the people hiring were desperate enough to take a clean record at face value. The site sat 60 miles north of Utqiagvik, out where the land stopped pretending to be anything but flat white exposure. When the last leg-in took place in a vehicle that rattled so badly my teeth ached, snow hissed against the sides. The driver didn't say much beyond asking if I was the new night guard. I told him yes. That answer had become easy by then. Frostline looked less like a hospital than a utility plant somebody had tried to soften with institutional windows. Low concrete blocks, outer fencing, steam staining the roof vents. Most of the facility was dark but not abandoned. Dark. There were squares of yellow light here and there, steady and watchful. The sign by the gate had the word containment in smaller letters under psychiatric, as if somebody had added the more honest term later. Inside, everything smelled of hot dust, old filters, and the metallic dryness of overworked heat. The front intake office had a check-in terminal, a dead ficus in a ceramic pot, and a wall of framed compliance certificates, half of them taken down, the hooks still there. Decommissioned, that was the word the contractor had used on the phone. Partially decommissioned. Still staffed for monitoring and asset security. Easy money. Easy money was what men called it when they were trying not to name the rest. I got my orientation from a folder, a screen, and one woman who never fully looked up from the access panel she was rewiring. The folder gave me maps for the active wings, emergency procedures, and a staff list that looked too short for a place that size. The screen made me initial pages about restricted areas, communication protocol, patient privacy, and equipment liability. The woman introduced herself as Brenna Sutter, maintenance. She had her sleeves rolled up despite the cold, and there was dark grease under one thumbnail. Her hair was tied back with what looked like a strip torn from a blue glove. Every few minutes she'd pause like she was listening for a sound behind the wall that the rest of us couldn't hear. "You're on nights?" she asked. That's what they told me. Mostly solo. Fine by me. That got the closest thing to a smile out of her. It was brief and not especially kind. Sure, she said. Everybody says that the first day. The orientation folder listed 3 active levels, 2 sealed wards, 1 archive annex, 1 power corridor, 1 maintenance bay, and staff accommodations that seemed too intact for a place supposed to be winding down. Somebody had highlighted my route between the security desk, camera room, and dorm wing with a yellow marker that had bled through the paper. At the bottom of the map, in handwriting that didn't match the printed packet, somebody had written, "Ignore old signage." I asked Brenna what that meant. Means ignore old signage. That's helpful. It's more helpful than the system logs. She said it casually, still working the screwdriver into the panel, but that was the first phrase from Frostline that stayed with me. Don't trust the system logs. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. In places like that, people signaled what kind of trouble they were willing to discuss and what kind they weren't. I signed the last form. The signature came out in a name I had practiced enough that my hand didn't shake anymore. I could have written it in the dark. The terminal accepted it at once. A small green bar moved across the screen. Identity verified. I remember that now because it was the first lie Frostline let me tell. They issued me a badge, a ring of physical keys that looked mostly ceremonial, and a radio that crackled with a bed of static under every transmission. My room was a narrow dorm off the staff corridor with a cot, a steel locker, and a vent that rattled all night long. Somebody had left an old mug in the sink with a ring of mineral crust at the bottom. Somebody else, or maybe the same person, had scratched a line into the paint near the doorframe at shoulder height. There was no reason for me to notice it. I noticed it anyway. That first evening I walked the active routes with the day guard, a tired man named Lerner who kept talking about overtime and never once mentioned patients. I asked how many were still housed there. He said, "Yeah, it depends what you mean by housed." Then he laughed like it was nothing, or like he'd already decided it wasn't his problem anymore. The corridors were too warm and too dry. My tongue kept sticking to the roof of my mouth. There was a low electrical hum everywhere, more felt than heard, a vibration under the quieter sounds of vent fans and distant plumbing. In certain halls, the hum deepened and the skin along my forearms prickled with static. Lerner said not to lean against the walls in those sections because the grounding was unreliable. He showed me the desk where I'd spend most of the night, the monitor bank, the printer, the manual sign-in sheets in case the internal network stalled. He pointed out the break room coffee, the emergency shut-off box nobody had ever needed, and the intercom controls I wasn't supposed to use unless directed. Directed by who? I asked. He shrugged. System prompt, admin, whoever answers. Who answers? He was already halfway out of the room. You'll see. That was the last normal conversation I had at Frostline. My first shift started at 10 in the evening. Brenna passed through the camera room with a toolbox, nodded toward the monitors and asked if I had everything I needed. I told her yes. She stood there a second longer than necessary. Then she said, "If something looks wrong in the logs, leave it wrong." I gave her a look. She held up one hand. "I'm not joking." "What kind of wrong?" "The kind that wants you to fix it." Before I could ask what that meant, her radio hissed. She looked at it, didn't answer, and kept walking. And the static in the air touched my neck like dry fingers. I wish I'd taken my bag and left then. I didn't. I sat down under the humming lights with my badge clipped to my jacket and a borrowed name in my pocket and waited for the night to begin sorting itself. It did, just not in any way I'd expected. The first discrepancy came through the printer a little after midnight. I heard it before I saw it, that abrupt mechanical clearing of the throat, rollers engaging, paper pulling through. The security desk printer had been idle for over an hour. I hadn't sent anything to it. Nothing in the camera room required hard copies unless there was an incident. And the most exciting thing I'd had so far was a motion alert from an empty rec room where a hanging strap had swayed under the vent. When the page came out, and the smell of hot toner spread through the room, sharp and chemical against the dry heat. I walked over expecting a system self-test. It was the night shift log. The page had my start time, my post assignment, a timestamp, and a line for signature. Under assigned personnel, where the system should have printed the name I was using, it said, Calder v. Ivers. Not even cleanly. The last name was missing a letter. Ivers. Close enough to make my pulse kick once, hard. I stood there with the page in my hand while the hum from the ceiling settled into my jaw. I hadn't used that name on any paperwork at Frostline. Not on the application, not on the travel confirmation, not on the onboarding forms, not on the badge they clipped to me at intake. There were explanations, there always were if you wanted them badly enough. A contractor database merge, an old employment pull. Somebody in admin cross-linking records from my previous job. A clerical mistake. That was the one I chose because it was the easiest to hold. I took a pen from the desk and corrected the spelling by instinct before I even understood what I was doing. I filled in the missing letter. I made the name whole. Then I stared at it. There are mistakes you can blame on stress, and there are mistakes that expose what your hands know before your mouth will admit it. That one belonged to the second kind. I folded the page once and put it under the keyboard. For the next 2 hours, I worked as if nothing had happened. I checked feeds. I logged a minor door fault. I walked the north hall and the admin corridor. In the halls with bad grounding, the static lifted the hair under my sleeves. Once, while I stood by the nurse's station in the darkened ward, the intercom above me clicked on and stayed silent long enough that I found myself listening for breath. None came, just the hum. Then it clicked off again. At 2 in the morning, the printer started up a second time. I didn't move right away. I listened to it spit one page, then another half page, then stop. By the time I reached it, the metallic taste in the air had thickened so much it felt like I could chew it. The new shift log was the same as the first, except the earlier page might as well never have existed. My pen correction was gone. The assigned personnel line now read, Rourke Ellison Hale, clean print, correct spacing, no typo. The name hit me like a sudden drop in floor pressure. I knew that name better than my own. I'd used it to sign payroll forms and training renewals. I'd used it to rent a room in Prudhoe Bay, to buy groceries, to keep my life moving forward one false document at a time. Seeing it there should have calmed me. It was the identity I had built my survival on. Instead, it felt like being recognized by a machine. There was another sheet under the log, only half printed, as if the system had jammed and recovered. On it, in skewed black letters, was my name again, not the stolen one, not the one from the corrected log, but the first one slightly wrong. Calder Vaughn Ivor, no period, no final S. Just enough missing to make it look unfinished. I remember the sound the page made when I picked it up. Dry paper, stiff with toner heat. I remember how cold my fingertips had gotten despite the room's warmth. And that was when I should have gone to Brenna or packed, or at least admitted to myself that whatever was happening had chosen a nerve it couldn't have found by chance. Instead, I did what men like me always do first. I tried to clean the paperwork. I deleted the print job history. I checked the desk terminal for queued admin reports. Nothing. I opened the internal shift roster and found the digital version already updated to Rourke Ellison Hale. I changed it back. Not to Calder, I wasn't that stupid. I changed it to the name in my personnel file, the same one on my badge, the same one I'd carried into the building. The screen froze. Not dramatically, no warning tone, no error box. The cursor just stopped blinking. For a few seconds, the hum in the walls seemed louder than the room itself. Then the roster refreshed. Unassigned personnel had changed again. It no longer listed Rourke Hale. It listed discrepancy under review. At the bottom of the page, in a field that hadn't been there before, a status note appeared. Manual correction detected. A minute later, the printer woke for a third time. This time it only gave me one strip of paper, no wider than a receipt. The letters were faint and dragged on one side like the cartridge was running low. Do not report name errors. No sender, no header, no signature. I crumpled it without meaning to, then smoothed it back open. The paper crackled under my fingers. My mouth had gone dry enough to hurt. I thought about Brenna saying not to trust the system logs. I thought about the way she'd phrased it, like the logs weren't just unreliable, but interested. For the rest of the shift, I stopped touching anything I didn't have to. I signed the paper backup sheet in the borrowed name. I kept the printed strip in my pocket. At 3:30, while walking the East Admin Hall, I passed a recessed service locker with its metal door half open. Inside, I saw stacked binders, a flashlight, and what looked like loose paper stuffed into a winter glove. I almost kept walking. Instead, I stopped, backed up, and opened the locker the rest of the way. That was how I found the rule. The locker smelled like old paper, rust, and trapped heat, the sour, dry odor of a place shut too long. Static tickled across the backs of my hands when I reached in. There wasn't any maintenance equipment inside, just a hard hat, a dead radio, and a bundle of handwritten pages held together with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. He'd written across the top page in block capitals pressed deep enough to dent the sheet beneath it was one name: Rourke Ellison Hale. For a second, the hallway lost all sense of temperature. I could hear the vent above me pushing hot air, could taste metal on my tongue, but my skin went cold anyway. The handwriting wasn't mine. I need to say that plainly. It wasn't mine. The letters slanted harder, the downstrokes dug deeper, and there were places where the pen had paused so long it bled through. But I knew the name. I knew what it cost to see it on official paper. Seeing it on a private page felt worse. I took the bundle into the camera room and read. The first pages were notes, timestamps, hall names, snatches of observation written like somebody trying to leave behind a usable map while the map itself kept changing. North Admin Corridor, line static stronger after 1 in the morning. Do not stand under intercoms when they click and wait. Cameras in sealed wards still active though panel says disconnected. Then the rules, not numbered, just repeated across multiple pages with revisions and frantic underlines. If your name appears incorrectly on any document, do not report it. On the next page, the same line had been rewritten 3 times. Do not report it. Do not correct it. Do not show anyone. Another page. If you hear your name spoken over the intercom, do not respond. Below that, in smaller handwriting, added later, maybe in a hurry. If it uses the wrong name first, still do not answer the right one. I turned to the next sheet. If you see yourself on a camera feed, leave that area immediately. That one had no notes. It just a line pressed so hard through the paper that the words showed on the back. Then another. Do not access archived personnel files. Somebody had started to write why beneath it, then scratched the explanation out until the page tore. The 5th rule was written sideways in the margin of a maintenance request. If a door opens for you without input, do not go through it. And the last one, the one that made the room seem to tilt around me. If someone calls you by a name you do not recognize, answer anyway. That rule had more annotation than the others. Whole sentences, then cross-outs, then rewritten versions that contradicted one another. Answer at once. No, wait. Answer if the voice is human. No, that's worse. Answer before the system repeats it. Do not let it escalate to discrepancy. At the bottom of the page, almost illegible, Eat one final line. It's not asking who you are. It's asking which record to keep. I read that 3 times. Then I went back to the first page and read the name again. Rourke Ellison Hale. The same name on my false credentials. The same name that had just appeared in the shift log. The same name that had followed me north in my wallet and on my employment file. I told myself there were only 2 possibilities. Either some former guard at Frostline happened to have the same name as the man whose life I had been wearing, or the facility had found a way to crawl into a part of me no background check should have reached. Neither possibility helped. Buried halfway through the bundle was a page that looked more like a journal entry than a rule list. The handwriting was shakier there. I made the mistake of correcting the roster, and that seems to make it commit harder. Once the system chooses a line, let it keep the typo if that's all it is. The real problem is when it gets something true. I stopped reading after that and listened to the room. The printer was quiet. The monitor bank buzzed. Somewhere beyond the walls, something heavy clanked once in the ductwork and settled. The hum under everything else continued, steady as a held note. I could feel it through the soles of my boots. Looking back, those pages weren't instructions. They were an argument already lost, preserved in handwriting because handwriting was the last thing in Frostline that still looked like it belonged to a person. I should have burned them. Instead, I kept reading until dawn put a gray wash over the upper windows and my eyes felt sanded raw. On the final page of the bundle, no signature, no date. There was one sentence written so neatly it looked copied from somewhere else. If you hear me tell you to trust the records, it isn't me anymore. When Brenna came through at shift change, I hid the pages under the blotter pad and watched her face for any sign she recognized the name on them. If she did, she didn't show it. By the next night, Frostline had moved on from paper. It started with the cameras. Every old security room has its own smell once it warms up after midnight. Dust inside plastic housings, hot circuitry, stale coffee sunk into particle board. Frostline's camera room had that, plus the constant dry metallic taste from the heating system, like the air itself had been run through a filing cabinet. I was halfway through a standard feed check when the North Treatment Corridor camera flickered. Not off, not to snow, just a quick stutter, frame skip, then live picture again. I leaned closer. The corridor on screen was empty except for me. I was in frame near the west door, one hand on my radio, looking slightly down because I'd been checking the wall sign under that camera in real time. I remember the cold static crawling over my neck when I saw myself because the image lag should have matched the movement I had just made. Instead, there were 2 of me. One body stood exactly where I was supposed to be. The second stood half a step behind the first, almost shoulder to shoulder, like a reflection that had forgotten mirrors put space between things. It wore the same jacket, same posture, same clipped badge, but it moved wrong. Not wildly, nothing theatrical. Its breathing was off rhythm from mine. When I turned my head in the live hall, and the rear figure on the screen waited a fraction too long, then followed. When I shifted my weight, it anticipated me by a beat. I swallowed and tasted hot metal. The rules were in my jacket pocket. I could feel the folded pages against my ribs like trapped heat. If you see yourself on a camera feed, leave that area immediately. I grabbed the desk radio and told myself to be calm. What I had was a display echo, a sync problem, a compression artifact from an older system. I had worked enough isolated sites to know cameras lied all the time. Then the second figure lifted its left shoulder in a small, involuntary hitch. I hadn't moved. There are gestures the body keeps after injury, not dramatic ones, not the things movies care about. Tiny accommodations, a guarded shoulder, fingers that don't fully close, a stance adjusted by pain memory, and the figure behind me had one of those. I knew it because I'd seen it under floodlights once. on a concrete deck slick with oil and sleet, in the half-minute before I chose not to help. I pushed back from the console so fast the chair wheels skidded. On the monitor, the forward version of me turned. The rear one didn't. It was looking directly into the camera. I spun around in the room hard enough to pull something in my side. There was nobody behind me. Just the doorway, the humming monitor bank, the printer with its dark mouth, the empty hall beyond. When I looked back at the screen, there were still two figures in the corridor. This time, the one in back took a step closer. I don't remember deciding to move. One second I was at the console, the next I was out in the hall, boots loud on waxed floor, air hotter there than it should have been. Static prickled over both arms at once. The intercom above the medication room clicked on. No voice came through. I ran the rest of the way to the treatment corridor. It was empty. The camera on the ceiling stared down in its smoked dome. The rule in my pocket might as well have been ice against my chest. I forced myself to look around carefully because panic makes people stupid, and I needed to stay functional. Empty bench, locked supply alcove, window showing black outside, no second figure. Then the intercom in that corridor clicked again. A breath came through this time. Not a full inhale, just the start of one, like somebody preparing to speak. I left. I didn't walk fast. I didn't run. I just turned and got out of that area exactly the way the page had told me to, and I didn't stop until the static on my skin eased. Back in the camera room, the north corridor feed was normal again. One empty hall. No duplicate, no lag. I replayed the last minute from buffer storage. The recording showed only me. Not two figures, not a flicker. Just me standing in the hall, looking up, then abruptly leaving frame. I replayed it again. Same result. That was the moment the rules stopped feeling like superstition and started feeling like a manual left by somebody who had already failed every test Frostline could invent. I checked system diagnostics. No error report. I checked camera logs. Access denied on archived playback. I checked the operator signature attached to the feed review. The system listed it under Rourke Hale. The rest of that shift passed in long stretches of enforced procedure wrapped around short, ugly bursts of fear. I walked every active hall. I ignored two silent intercom clicks. I refused to look too long at my own reflection in any dark window. By 4 in the morning, I had convinced myself I could hold it together until daylight, and then maybe Brenna would tell me what kind of breakdown the place specialized in. At 4:15, a sealed door at the end of East Admin buzzed once and opened by 3 inches. No one touched it. I didn't go through. I stood there in the dry, heated air, static snapping against my knuckles, and watched the darkness beyond the gap remain perfectly still. Then the door closed again. I went back to the desk and took the rule pages out one by one, smoothing the creases flat. On the back of one page, so faint I hadn't noticed it before, was a line from what looked like an incident form. Subject observed on camera behind self. No corresponding body in corridor. Log corrected automatically. I didn't sleep that day. I lay on the cot in the dorm with the vent rattling above me and the old line in the door frame at shoulder height catching my eye every time I looked over. At some point I understood it wasn't a scratch from furniture moving. It was a tally mark. Against the rule pages, the archive room became inevitable. There are doors in institutional buildings that smell different before you even open them. Not better or worse, just sealed for too long. The archive annex at Frostline carried that smell in the crack around its frame. Paper gone stale in dry air. Cardboard, old toner, dust with nowhere to go. By then I knew the rule. Do not access archived personnel files. And by then I also knew the rules at Frostline didn't protect you. They only described what previous people had learned too late. The annex sat off a corridor no longer marked on the active map. The wall placards had been removed, leaving cleaner rectangles on the paint. The electronic lock on the archive door should have required supervisor clearance. My badge opened it on the first try. That should have stopped me. Instead, it made me angrier. I went in with a flashlight, though the overheads came on 2 seconds later with a soft clunk and a wash of yellow that made everything look nicotine-stained. Shelving units ran in narrow rows. Banker boxes, old binders, obsolete terminals. In the back stood a records workstation, still powered, monitor asleep, tower humming with the same low current I heard everywhere else. Even there, maybe especially there, the facility sounded awake. The keyboard was warm when I touched it. I logged in with my security credentials. The system accepted them. For user, it displayed R.E. Hale. I told myself the sight of that shouldn't matter anymore. It did anyway. Personnel archive wasn't on the main menu. I found it through search, nested inside a section labeled Legacy Retention. The first name I entered was my own, the real one. Calder Vaughn Ivers. No records found. I tried the name on my credentials. Rourke Ellison Hale. The screen loaded a file so large the scroll bar shrank to a sliver. Not one personnel record, many. Versions, amendments, duplicates with slight differences. They didn't run cleanly by date. They layered over one another like correction fluid on reused paper. The earliest file was ordinary enough. Employment intake, security certification, emergency contact, height, weight, training hours. But the more I clicked, the stranger the sequence became. One annual evaluation listed Hale with a start date at Frostline more than a year before I had ever seen his driver's license. Another had the right start date but the wrong middle initial. Then a version with no emergency contact. Then a version where the signature line was blank but still marked acknowledged. Then a scanned badge photo that showed a face too washed out to identify, as if the features had been lifted away by overexposure. I kept opening records. The air in the archive room grew hotter, or else I stopped noticing heat and only felt the dry scrape in my throat. My skin prickled continuously, not in isolated snaps anymore, but in a fine crawling layer from wrist to neck. And the progression was there if I looked sideways at it. First misspellings, then omissions, then substitutions. In one disciplinary memo, Hale became Hall. In another, the surname vanished entirely and left only Rourke E. There was a payroll file in which his tax identifier had been replaced by zeros. A dorm assignment sheet listed his room, then listed it vacant, then listed it occupied by someone else with the same employee number. I opened an attachment stamped correction review and found a note in formal administrative language that chilled me more than anything handwritten had. Record inconsistency appears self-propagating across linked systems. Recommend minimal intervention. Manual reconciliation increases spread. Below that, in a later notation, likely added by someone who had stopped pretending the language meant anything. And do not let subject see prior versions. I clicked again and found a badge issue report. The photo field was blank. Under status, one line, correction complete. I sat back so abruptly the chair groaned. Blank photo, full replacement. No explanation of what had been corrected or into what. Just complete, as if the absence itself were the final accurate record. Then I noticed something worse. Several files in the middle of the sequence contained details from my life. Not all at once. Just enough to poison denial. A prior posting at a remote oil logistics site, night security clearance, an emergency contact number I had once used and later disconnected, training cert codes tied to work I'd actually done. The name on those files was still Rourke Hale. The history under it was mine. I don't know how long I sat there scrolling between records, trying to find a line where one man ended and the other began. The facility didn't seem interested in that distinction. It was treating identity like paperwork under revision, not fact. I searched for incident records tied to the oil site. One result appeared unlabeled in restricted media. I clicked it and got a request for elevated permissions. A second later, the request disappeared on its own, replaced by a message. Manual access logged. Somewhere in the annex, a printer started, not the desk printer from the camera room. Another one farther back among the shelves. I followed the sound down a row and found a single page waiting in the tray. No header, no date, just typed text. If you are reading archived personnel corrections, it is already using comparison. Below that, handwritten in the same hard script as the rules. Stop now. And it copies faster once you know the pattern. I looked over my shoulder. Nothing there. Just rows of boxes and the yellow buzzing lights. Still, I folded the page and put it in my pocket. That's when I saw the locker inventory binder on the shelf beside the printer. Inside, among old equipment sign-outs, a handwritten note was paper-clipped to a tab for former security staff. If Hale asks to see his original file, do not allow unsupervised access. My hands started shaking then, not hard, but enough that the paper whispered. I hadn't just found records of a man being overwritten. I'd found proof the system or the people around it expected him to come looking. When I finally left the archive, the hall outside felt cooler, though I knew it wasn't. At the main desk, I checked the active staff roster. My name wasn't there. Neither one. He's under night security. The line read, "Position filled." That was when helplessness really set in. Not fear. Helplessness. The heavy practical understanding that every attempt to verify myself had only given the place more material to work with. I know now that the archive room wasn't forbidden because it contained answers. It was forbidden because once you saw what correction looked like in sequence, you started recognizing it everywhere. Brenna found me in the break room just before dawn, sitting with the copied badge photo report in one hand, and a cup of coffee I'd gone too numb to drink in the other. The coffee smelled burnt and weak. The heater in the wall clicked and clicked but never shut off. She took one look at my face and said, "You went into archives." I didn't ask how she knew. "You told me not to trust the logs," I said. "And you didn't say the files were infected." She leaned against the counter, arms folded, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she seemed tired in a way that went beyond shift work. Not sleepy, worn down along some deeper grain. "I figured you'd find that out on your own. Who is Rourke Hale?" Her eyes moved to the pages on the table. She didn't touch them. "Which version?" I laughed once. It came out wrong. "I need an honest answer." "You want an honest answer," she said, "or one that's still useful inside this building." The vent pushed another breath of metallic warmth across the room. It carried that strange mineral taste every heater at Frostline seemed to share. I realized I had started associating it with bad information before it arrived. "Brenna." She shook her head at once. "Don't use full names in here unless you have to. You introduced yourself that way. Outside intake. I don't anymore." There was a beat where I thought she might leave. Instead, she pulled out the chair opposite me and sat. "I haven't used my real name in the active wings for 8 months, she said. "Maybe longer. Hard to say exactly. The system gets leverage through labels. Names first, then signatures, then voice. Once it has a stable identifier, it starts reconciling." "Reconciling what?" She looked toward the ceiling, not because she expected to see through it, but because that's where the intercom speakers sat. "Discrepancies." I pushed the archive page toward her. "Blank photo. Correction complete." "This is a person." "Yeah. What happened to him?" Another pause. She rubbed her thumb over a grease smear on the side of her hand, it as if trying to clean it off by pressure alone. "Maybe he got corrected. Maybe he got filed under something else. Maybe he left and the records stayed to finish what they were doing. Depends whether you think the paperwork follows the body or the other way around." That answer should have made me angry. Instead, it scared me because she said it like somebody reciting weather patterns. "Why are you still here?" She gave me a look so flat it felt almost kind. "Same reason you came. Places like this are good for people who don't want too much scrutiny." There it was, gentle as a knife set on a table between us. Before I could answer, the intercom in the break room clicked on. Static, then silence. Then the system voice, calm and almost human, paused as if checking a card before speaking. "Rourke," it said. Not loud, just clear. Brenna's whole body tightened. The voice continued, "Please report to North Access." It clicked off. For a second, all I heard was the building hum and my own pulse knocking in my ears. Brenna spoke first, very quietly. "Did you answer it before?" "No." "Good. It used the wrong name." Her gaze snapped back to mine. "Wrong according to who?" I didn't say anything. She leaned forward. "Listen to me carefully. Names in here are entry points. Every time you confirm or deny one, you're giving the system relationship data. That lets it build continuity. That's what the old rules meant. Don't report name errors. Don't argue with them. Do not help it make comparisons." "What about the last rule?" I asked. "If someone calls you by a name you don't recognize, answer anyway." Her face changed then, not much, but enough that I knew she'd been hoping I hadn't read that one. "That's the ugly rule," she said. "That's for when it escalates." "Escalates how?" "If it can't pin you to a stable record, it marks you discrepancy. After that, doors stop agreeing with each other. Cameras stop agreeing with halls. Sometimes staff stop agreeing they'd spoken to you. Answering a wrong name can buy time because it lets the system temporarily settle on a line. But every time you do it, something sticks." "What sticks?" She looked at me for so long I almost thought she wouldn't answer. "Whatever it needs to make the paperwork cleaner." I thought of the archive records, misspellings, omissions, substitutions, blank photo. "What do I call you?" I asked. She stood up. "Inside active spaces. Unsutter is enough. That's still your name. It's one of them." Then she did something that frightened me more than the intercom had. She smiled, tired and crooked, and said, "Don't tell me the one you started with. I don't want to know who the building should compare you to." That was the last real warning I got from another living person. By the following night, Frostline had started using my own voice against me. It came through the audio archive hidden under routine security exports. A folder I only checked because the system had begun logging intercom activations I hadn't heard. The file names were time-stamped several hours ahead of the current shift. I remember staring at one marked for 3:47 in the morning while the desk clock still said 1:12. I played it anyway. First I heard the room tone from the camera desk, and the same low electric hum, the rustle of a sleeve, the tiny plastic creak of the chair when I leaned back. Then my own voice spoke, calm, tired, matter-of-fact. "North corridor door is cycling on its own again. Do not go through if it offers access. Repeat, do not open that door." I stopped the file and checked the timestamp. Still ahead. I played it again. Same voice. Mine without question. Not a close imitation, not a distorted sample. The exact throat, cadence, breath placement I had listened to all my life in recordings and hated because everybody hates hearing themselves. Only there was something flattened in it, like the emotion had been filed off. I searched the export folder. There were 7 more clips from later that night and 1 from just before dawn. In another, my voice said, "If the cameras show 2 bodies, you trust the one that's farther from center frame." In another, "Do not let Sutter say your name inside North Admin." Then I opened the longest file. At first there was just static and what sounded like somebody moving quickly in a corridor, clothing brushing concrete block walls. Then a man started speaking, breathless, ragged, trying very hard to stay controlled and failing. "Don't answer if it calls you. Do you hear me? Don't answer. Not the first name, not the second one. Just keep walking." I knew the voice before I admitted I knew it. Rourke. Not from Frostline. From before. From a night with floodlights haloed in blowing ice. From the way he'd sounded after the load shifted and the metal arm came down wrong and pinned him against the rail. Not screaming. I need to be clear about that. He hadn't screamed. He'd just kept saying my name, unshocked and disbelieving and getting weaker each time, while I stood there with the radio in my hand and thought about my own life like it was the only emergency on site. In the recording, he kept talking. "You don't let it hear you agree. If you agree, it keeps the newer line. You don't owe it correction. You don't owe anyone correction." A second voice answered from farther back. My voice, only older somehow. Or emptied out. I don't know how else to describe it. "You have to answer, Rourke." I put a hand over my mouth but still listened. Rourke said, "Why are you here?" My voice replied, very calm, very near, "I already was." The file ended there. I sat in the camera room with the taste of hot pennies in my throat and the headphone cups pressing too hard against my ears. And all the space I had spent 2 years building between myself and the oil site collapsed at once. His name was Rourke Hale. He'd worked nights with me at a logistics hub north of Deadhorse, the kind of place that ran on fatigue and procedural shortcuts until one bad decision found a body to land in. The accident hadn't looked cinematic. Nothing exploded. A pallet arm misaligned in freezing conditions. A lockout skipped because we were behind. Rourke went down under shifting weight and I had seconds to call it in. I didn't. I wish I could tell you there was confusion or panic or that I believed he was already dead. The truth is uglier because it's smaller. I hesitated. Then I saw his wallet spilled open in the slush. I saw certifications, identification, a life cleaner than mine, no warrants, no debt collectors, and no old bar fight record waiting to poison every background check. And in the space where a decent person makes one choice, I made another. I left. He survived. I learned that later through a contact who still answered my calls back then. Crushed shoulder, nerve damage, couldn't go back to the work. While he was trying to relearn how to hold a coffee cup without pain, I was learning the shape of his signature. That's the wound at the center of all this. Not guilt in the abstract. Theft with a living face attached to it. A man I didn't just fail but replaced. Frostline hadn't found a generic weakness in me. It had found the exact administrative lie my life depended on and started pressing. And I replayed the recording 3 times because human beings do that when they are trying to prove to themselves that horror can be understood if you study it long enough. Each time, the same thing happened. Rourke begged. My voice answered. The file ended. Ahead of time timestamp. No explanation. Then I checked the desk clock. 3:47 in the morning. The exact minute on the first clip. The intercom clicked on immediately. My voice came through the speaker above the monitor wall. North corridor door is cycling on its own again. Do not go through if it offers access. Word for word. I didn't move. One by one, the future recordings became present. Every warning I had already heard arrived on schedule, either through the intercom or as auto-generated desk memos printed seconds before the event. It wasn't prediction. It was replay. And each time it happened, the room around me felt less solid, as if the facility preferred documented sequence to lived experience and was gradually forcing my body to follow the file. At 4:21, another audio clip appeared in exports, time-stamped 6 in the morning. I didn't play it. I was afraid of hearing who I was by then. At 4:30, the North admin access door unlocked on its own. Silently, no buzz, no latch click, just the indicator shifting from red to green in my peripheral vision. I heard my own recorded voice in memory saying, "Don't open that door." I stayed where I was. The light remained green for a full minute, then changed back. That should have been a victory. It didn't feel like one. It felt like I'd obeyed one version of myself at the expense of understanding what the other version had wanted. And from that point on, every choice at Frostline started coming in pairs, both wrong in different directions. By the 8th night, the replacement had stopped being subtle. It was in the doors first. Access panels I had used for days began recognizing me before I presented my badge. I would approach, feel the static raise along my neck, and hear the lock cycle open as if somebody on the other side had hit release. Rules said not to go through if a door opened without input. I obeyed that until refusing started trapping me in shrinking loops of corridor and checkpoint forced farther and farther into the active wings. Then it spread to the intercom. At first the system called for Rourke. Later it tried other names, some almost familiar, some entirely foreign. Once it announced in that level administrative tone, "Il Night Security to Records Reconciliation." Another time it paused long enough to make me think the line had died, then said, "Mr. Vale, report to exit processing." I had never used the name Vale. I had never heard it in Frostline before. Yet when the speaker said it, something low in my stomach clenched with the cold certainty of recognition. Not emotional recognition, but procedural. Like hearing the next item in a list you didn't know you were memorizing. I didn't answer. 30 seconds later, the monitors at the desk all refreshed to static for one full breath, then returned with the staff roster pinned over the lower corner of every feed. Night Security no longer listed Rourke Hale. It listed Martin Vale. Under employment status, active. Under previous status lines, inaccessible. That was the point at which the